Following Vashti's refusal to appear before Achashverosh, Achashverosh summons his Chachamim Yodei Ha'itim, his wise men, those who know the times, to figure out what to do about Vashti. Now, the simple understanding, those who are Mefarish al Pi Pshat explain that he was calling his advisors, his Chachamim, his wise men, Yodei Ha'itim, those who knew the times, meaning those who understood context and what was going on, and different circumstances lead to different sentences, and he was asking those who understood the times and the context in order to decide what to do about Vashti. However, the Gemara that we learned on Daf Yud Beis Amud Beis of Megillah gives a surprising interpretation. The Gemara says, "Vayarm Hamelcha Chachamim, Man Chachamim, who are these wise men, Rabbanan?" He asked the Rabbanan, the rabbis, Yodei Ha'itim, those who knew the times, Sheyodin la'aber shanim v'likvoa chadashim, those who know how to make an ibur shana, a leap year, when to add an extra month of Adar, an extra month to the year, and those who know how to establish the months, when it's a full month, when it's a short month, 29-day month, a 30-day month, depending on when the moon is sighted, etc., or the establishment of the calendar. So he called on the Chachamim who knew the calendar, basically, who knew how to calculate the calendar. That's who he was calling upon to determine what to do about Vashti. Now the Gemara goes on and says that they refused to, they kind of weaseled their way out of it, they didn't want to say anything. But how are we to understand this Gemara? Why on earth would Achashverosh summon Chachamim, the Jewish rabbis, and specifically those who are Yodei Ha'itim, those who know how to calculate the calendar? What does that have to do with determining what Vashti's sentence should be for refusing to appear before him? It seems to have nothing to do with what's going on. So I want to share with you two approaches from Rabbi Yonasan Eivshitz in his Yaros Devash that are just creative, brilliant, and fun. So the first is in Chelek Aleph of Yaros Devash, Drush Yud Zayin, the 17th drasha there, and he suggests as follows. He says that we know that Achashverosh made this party at the beginning of the third year of his kingship, right? The party began at the beginning of the third year of his kingship. Now, the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah tells us that Malchei Umas HaOlam, the kings of the other nations, they count their years based on Tishrei. So as soon as Tishrei comes, begins a new year. So which means that the beginning of his third year would be at the beginning of Tishrei. So the party began in the beginning of Tishrei. Now, the Manas HaLevi, Reb Shlomo Alkabetz, quotes a medrash that the medrash says, the pasuk says that the party was Yamim Rabim, Shmonim U'Ma'as Yom. It was Yamim Rabim, many days, Shmonim U'Ma'as Yom, 180 days. So what is Yamim Rabim adding? Many days. Just tell me, it was 180 days. So the medrash says that Yamim is plural, means days, 2 days. Rabim is even more, many is 3 more days, and that which means there were 2 and 3 additional days besides for the 180 days, which would mean that the Suda, the feast, really began 5 days before the 180 days, which means that the Suda was actually 185 days. So that would mean that it began at the beginning of Tishrei, Rosh Hashanah, and it went for 185 days. Now, which would mean that would take, in Jewish months, if you have basically 6 months, and if some are Malay, some are, let's say, of the 6 months, 3 of them are Malay, are 30 days, and 3 are 29 days. So it would turn out, if you make the calculation, so that's how months usually are approximately. There's 2 months that could be different, but otherwise they basically switch off. And so if you make the calculation, if 6 over 6 months, so from Tishrei, so if 3 of the months were 30 days, that's 90 days, and if 3 of them were 29 days, that's another 87 days. So 90 and 87 is 100 and 90 and 87 is 177. So 177 days would have been 6 months later, the beginning of Nisan. Now we have to get to 185 days. That would mean that 8 days later, on the 8th of Nisan, was the end of the 185 days. So the end of the first party was on the 8th of Nisan. Now we know, the Megillah goes on and says that after at the end of those 180 days, Asa Mishteh, he made another party for the people of Shushan. And that was for 7 days, right? On the 7th day, when he was drunk, that's when he summoned Vashti. Now 7 days after the 8th of Nisan is the 15th of Nisan, which would be the first night of Pesach, Leil Seder, or the first day of Pesach, depending on when this happened. But it's the 15th of Nisan. So the night that he summoned Vashti was the 15th of Nisan, was the night of Pesach. Now what is the significance of that for them? There's actually probably a lot you could do with that, but for our purposes today, so he says that we know that Vashti was the daughter of Belshazzar, who was the third king of Babylonia, Belshazzar was Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. Vashti was his daughter. And when was Belshazzar killed? When was that event where Belshazzar took out the Kelim of the Beis Hamikdash? He thought that the Jews were never going back, like we learned. When did that occur? That also occurred on Leil Pesach. That happened the night of Pesach. Says Rabbi Yonah Sangaivshitz, we say this is based on a medrash, we say it at the Seder if you get to this in Nirtza. So one of the songs is Vayihi B'Chatzi Alayla, and there's a line that piyut, that song at the end of the Seder, is going through all different events that happened on the night of Pesach, and one of them, as we say, is Mishtaker B'Kli Kodesh Nerag Bo B'Layla. He got drunk with the Klei Kodesh, with the holy vessels, and he was killed that night. That's referring to Belshazzar, which means Belshazzar, Vashti's father, was killed on the 15th of Nisan. Now, if this is the night that her father was killed, says Rabbi Yonah Sangaivshitz, then you can't blame her that she didn't want to come to Achashverosh, at this time and be a part of his celebration. Yes, we know she had made her own party, but now was her father's yartzeit, the day of her father's passing. It's a day of Avelus, a day of mourning. And he says, he brings from Gemaras and other places that they would bring offerings to Avodah Zarah on that day, and therefore it would have been understandable that she refused to come. It says Rabbi Yonah Sangaivshitz, that's only if it was actually her father's yahrzeit, really the 15th of Nisan. But if that year was actually a leap year, and there was an extra Adar, then 185 days, or really 185 plus 7, 192 days after the beginning of the feast would not be the 15th of Nisan. Rather, it would be the 15th of Adar, and of Adar Sheni. And in that case, it's not the yahrzeit of her father, and in that case, she's not justified in not coming before Achashverosh. So that is why Achashverosh wanted the sages who understood the calendar to come before him, because he wanted to know if this year should be considered a leap year, and therefore Vashti has no excuse for not coming, because it's only the 15th of Adar and not the 15th of Nisan, and it's not the day of her father's passing, and also additionally he had to know the calculation. See, our calculation assumed that the 6 months that elapsed, 3 were 30-day months and 3 were 29-day months. But that also could fluctuate. In particular, the months of Kislev and Cheshvan, those are the ones that sometimes 29, sometimes 30. And so part of the calculation, you also needed to know if the months, Yodei, you have to know the Kvius of the Chadashim, the establishment of the months, to know if it was exactly 192 days, it was 192 days, but if after 192 days brought us to the date of the 15th of Nisan, the passing of her father, which would justify her actions or not. And that's why Achashverosh needed to know, he needed to call before him the sages who understood the calendar, and the calculations of the calendar, because that would determine if if indeed Vashti had a good excuse for not coming because it was her father's yahrzeit, the date of her father's passing, or if she had no excuse because in fact it was not that date. That is the first explanation in the Yaros Tavash, Chelak Aleph Drush Yud Zayin. In Chelak Beis, Drush Beis, Yonasan Eifshitz has another creative suggestion. He says that before we are to judge Vashti, we first have to know how old Vashti was. We have to know if she is a Bas Onshim, if she is of an age that is deserving of punishment. Now, he quotes a medrash that for Gentiles, the age of adulthood, where they are Bar Onshim, they are liable for their actions, is 20 years old. So Achashverosh had to determine if Vashti was 20 years old or not. Now we know from a medrash that when Belshazzar was killed, the medrash has a story that they found her in the palace, and it calls her a naira, a lad, a girl. Now in a halachic context, in halacha and kiddushin, we had this a lot. So a naira is really between 12 and 12 and a half, specifically. Someone who's between 12 and 12 and a half years old. Now they married her to Achashverosh when they found her. So she was between 12 and 12 and a half. Now we know from the Gemaras that we've learned that Achashverosh made a calculation for when the Beis Hamikdash, when the Jews would not be coming back from exile, and based on the calculations the Gemara brought, we saw that 7 years passed from the death of Belshazzar until the beginning of the 3rd year of Achashverosh. So that would mean that if she was 12, or if she was 12 and a half, let's say, at the time that her father Belshazzar died, and 7 years have passed, then Achashverosh begins his party. So the beginning of his party, Vashti is now 19 and a half years old. Now, if he began the party right at the beginning of that year, and the party was 180 days, as the pasuk describes, so that means that 6 months elapsed. 6 months elapsed from when the party began, and that would mean if she was 19 and a half when the party began, and 6 months have elapsed, that means she is now 20 years old, and she's a Bas Onshim, and she could be killed for her actions. This, however, is only if it wasn't a leap year. If it wasn't a leap year, then the 6 months would take us to her birthday, which we're assuming based on these calculations would have been around Nisan time, I guess. But that's only if it wasn't a leap year. However, if it was a leap year and there was an extra month, so then the 6 months would end in Adar Sheni, in the second Adar, and she's not yet 20 years old. She hasn't come up to her birthday again. And if she's not yet 20 years old, then she is not deserving of at least capital punishment for her actions. And that's why Achashverosh needed to find out. He needed the sages to determine if it was a leap year. They had to know how to calculate the calendar in order to determine if she was a Bas Onshim. So again, the calculation, according to this, is that at the time that Belshazzar, her father, was killed, she was a naira. A naira is up to 12 and a half years old. This calculation assumes that she was basically 12 and a half at the time, or almost 12 and a half, within a few days of 12 and a half. And if that's the case, then 7 years later is she's going to be, when Achashverosh begins his party, she's going to be 19 and a half years old. After 180 days, that's approximately 6 months, she is going to she's going to be now 20 and a Bas Onshim, but only if it was, in fact, not a leap year. Then it would bring her to her birthday, bring her to the age 20, and she would be deserving of punishment. But if it was a leap year, so then it would not bring her up to her 20th birthday, and she's not deserving of punishment because she's not old enough to be punished. And that is why Achashverosh needed to summon the Jewish sages to find out if, in fact, it was a leap year or not a leap year. That is Rabbi Sanayev's second very creative understanding of this Gemara.